In northern Minnesota, there are nights when the cold is not weather, but a thing with weight. The snow does not fall. It is too cold for snow. The sky is clear and hard, and the silence is so deep that a nail popping in a barn board sounds like a pistol shot across the yard. On a night like that, a boy crouches beside a stone foundation, pressing his bare fingers into a crack between two fieldstones. His hands are wrapped in flour sack strips, dark at the knuckles. A gray cat sits behind him on a hay bale, watching, its left ear split to a sharp point. The air coming through the crack smells like earth, not like the barn, not like winter, like something underneath. Milo Eater stepped down from the county wagon into snow so hard it squeaked under his boots like a living thing biting back. He was 12 years old. His mother had been dead 6 days. His father had been dead 4 months, crushed under a collapsed lime kiln in the Watkins Quarry, and the county office in St. Cloud had found no uncles, no aunts, no grandparents, no cousins, and no one willing to claim a boy who coughed into his sleeve and owned one flour sack of clothes and a folding rule that still smelled of calcium dust. The Brunner farm sat 3 miles north of a crossroads that did not have a name. The nearest town office was 12 miles east by road, and the road had been drifted shut since January 28th. The county man who drove the wagon said he would check back in 2 weeks. He did not get out. He handed the flour sack to Milo, nodded once at the woman standing on the porch with her arms folded, and turned the horses before the runners froze to the ground. Lenora Bruner looked at Milo the way a person looks at a delivery that arrived damaged. She said the house had 2 rooms and both were full. She said the barn had a loft with straw. She said supper was at 6 and the pump handle needed greasing. Then she went inside and closed the door, and Milo stood in the yard holding his dead father's folding rule in one hand and his flour sack in the other, while the cold pressed against his face like a flat iron pulled from a frozen shelf. The barn was 30 paces from the house. It leaned slightly south, as though something beneath it had shifted years ago, and nobody had corrected it. The north wall had gaps between the boards wide enough to pass a finger through. Snow had driven in and settled in thin ridges along the floor like white veins running through gray wood. The loft was reached by a warped ladder missing its 3rd rung. At the top, Milo found a platform of rough planks, a pile of loose straw that smelled of mice, 1 horse blanket stiff enough to stand on its own, and a darkness so total he could not see the walls. He had no stove, no lamp after dusk, no permission to enter the house between meals, no permission to touch coal or cordwood. The Bruner placement paid August Bruner $4 a month in county relief, and for that Milo received a sleeping space that was, by any honest measure, a shelf in a building designed to keep cattle alive, not children. He could not leave. He had no money. His legal guardian was the county, and the county had placed him here with a signature and a wagon ride. The nearest open road was drifted under 3 feet of wind-packed snow. He knew no one within walking distance. He had a cough he hid by pressing his mouth into his coat sleeve, because he had learned in the county home that sick children were moved last and fed least. That first night, the temperature inside the loft dropped low enough to freeze the moisture in his breath onto the blanket. By morning, the wool was crusted white. His fingers ached so deeply he thought the bones themselves were cold. Jonas Klinkner arrived on the 2nd day. He came on a draft horse the color of wet slate, wearing a wool coat that reached his boot tops and a county badge pinned to a leather wallet. Klinkner was the poor relief visitor for the northern townships, a retired school trustee who believed that suffering built character and that charity, administered too generously, built dependence. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had learned his kindness from ledger books and committee meetings, and who measured adequate care the way he measured adequate firewood, in units that looked reasonable on paper. He walked the barn without removing his gloves. He looked at the loft ladder, the straw pile, the frost feathers growing on the inside of the north-facing boards like tiny white ferns pressed against the wood. He said nothing for a long time. Then he turned to Lenora, who had followed him at a distance, and said the boy should sleep near the kitchen stove. August Brunner appeared from the cow stall. He was thick-necked, square-jawed, and had the posture of a man who had decided every question before it was asked. He said, "There is no room for strays in the house." Klinkner looked at the frost feathers. He looked at the blanket. He looked at August. August said the county was paying $4, and the coal bill was already more than he could carry. He said the boy was 12, not 2, and that farm children had slept in barns since barns were invented. He said if the county wanted hotel rooms for its wards, the county could pay hotel prices. Klinkner compromised. He ordered extra straw brought up to the loft. He told August to close the worst gaps in the north wall with scrap boards. He wrote in his notebook and put it away. Then he climbed the ladder, which creaked under his weight in a way it had not under Milo's, and stood in the loft looking at the boy who sat on the straw pile with his father's folding rule across his knees. Klinkner said, not unkindly, "A Minnesota winter is not a puzzle, boy. It is a furnace bill. Whoever cannot pay it loses." Milo said nothing. He had learned that adults who offered advice instead of blankets were not going to change his situation. Klinkner climbed down. At the barn door, he told August to bring the straw up by nightfall. August waited until the horse and rider disappeared past the tree line, then carried up 3 armloads of loose straw, not baled, not packed, just handfuls thrown, and dropped them near the platform edge. He stood over Milo. He said, "The cattle trough freezes overnight. You break it by 5 or you lose supper. That is the arrangement." Milo said, "Yes, sir." August said, "And you do not touch my coal. You do not touch my cordwood. You do not enter the house except at meals. You eat what is given. You do not complain to Klinkner or anyone else. If you do, I will tell the county you are unmanageable, and the next placement will be worse." He left. The barn door banged shut behind him. Snow sifted through the north wall gaps and settled on the straw like flour through a torn sack. Milo opened his father's folding rule. It was 24 inches, brass-jointed, scarred with quarry marks. He measured the gap in the north wall, 1 3/4 inches at the widest point. He measured the distance from the straw pile to the nearest board edge, 14 inches. He measured things because measuring was the only action available to him, and because his father had said that a man who measures before he acts will outlast a man who acts before he thinks. The second night was worse than the first. The wind came from the northwest and found every gap in the barn as though it had been mapping them. The straw August had thrown was loose and dry and scattered under any movement. Milo pulled the horse blanket over his head and pressed his body into the corner where 2 walls met, because corners hold heat longer than open spaces. His father had told him that. His father had told him many things about cold and stone and earth, and none of them seemed useful in a barn loft with no stone, no earth, and no father. By dawn, the inside of the blanket was wet with breath and the outside was stiff with frost. Milo's hands would not close properly. He climbed down the ladder and crossed to the cattle trough in a darkness so cold it felt solid, and he struck the ice with a fence post until it shattered. His shoulders burned. His cough came in spasms that bent him at the waist. August watched from the house window and did not open the door until breakfast. Martha Reich came on the 3rd day. She was the nearest neighbor, a 1/4 mile south across a field that was now a single unbroken sheet of white. She was 50, broad-shouldered, and had opinions the way some people had furniture. They filled every room she entered. She was not cruel. She was practical in a way that left no space for softness, because softness in her experience was what people offered instead of solutions. She brought a jar of pickled beets for Lenora and saw Milo crouched beside the barn's north wall, pressing chaff and torn newspaper into the gaps between the boards. He had found the newspaper in a feed bin. He had torn it into strips and was rolling the strips into tight cylinders and wedging them into the cracks with his thumbs. Martha watched for a moment. Then she said, "Newspaper and chaff will not stop air that is looking for a way in." Milo did not answer. He pressed another cylinder into a crack. Martha said, "I have seen grown men try to insulate barns in January. They burn through newspaper, rags, moss, corn husks, and old flour sacks, and in the end the wind finds a new path. Air is patient, a boy is not." She set down the beet jar and pulled from her coat pocket a pair of mittens, patched, too large for his hands, smelling of lanolin and smoke. She held them out. "These will keep your fingers, but they will not keep you." She looked at the barn, at the gaps, at the frost on the inner boards. "Boys who sleep in barns in weather like this either get moved or get buried. I am telling you this because nobody else will." She left the mittens on a fence post and walked back across the white field. Milo took them. They were the first useful thing anyone had given him since his mother died. That night, wearing Martha's mittens and wrapped in every layer he owned, Milo lay in the loft and listened to the barn. He listened to the wind testing the north wall. He listened to the cattle shifting below, their bodies producing a faint warmth that rose and dispersed before it reached him. He listened to the mice in the straw, moving in quick bursts, then silence, then movement again. And he listened to something else, a sound so faint he was not sure he heard it at first, a scraping, clicking noise from below the loft near the foundation. Then silence, then a soft thump, as though something small and careful had landed on packed earth from a short height. He leaned over the loft edge and looked down into the darkness. He saw nothing, but the sound came again, a scrape, a click, a thump, and then a shape moved along the base of the wall, low and fluid, and disappeared. The barn cat appeared on Milo's fourth morning at the Brunner farm. It was gray, scarred, with a left ear split to a sharp point as though something had bitten through the cartilage and healed crooked. It was not tame. It did not come when called. It moved through the barn like smoke through a cracked window, present, then gone, with no clear path between the two states. Milo called it Needle because of the ear. Needle hunted mice in the hay. That was expected. But what was not expected was where Needle went when the hunting stopped. Every night at the coldest hour, the hour when even the cattle drew close together and the water in the trough began to creak with new ice, Needle would cross the barn floor, press itself against the foundation stones on the south wall, and disappear. Not behind a board, not under a pile, through the stones themselves. One moment the cat was there, a gray shape against the gray rock, and the next moment it was not. Milo watched this 3 nights in a row from the loft. On the third night, he climbed down and knelt where Needle had vanished. His fingers found the foundation. Fieldstones, mortared unevenly, some the size of bread loaves, others the size of his fists. Between 2 of the larger stones he felt a gap. Not wide, his hand would not fit through, but the gap breathed. He could feel it. Not warm air, not cold air, something between. Damp, steady, carrying a smell of packed earth and old stone, a smell nothing like the hay and manure air of the barn above. He pressed his face close and breathed in. The air that touched his cheeks was not warm, but it was not the air that was killing him in the loft either. It was still. It was underground air. It was air that did not move with the wind. He pulled back and sat against the foundation, thinking. His father's voice came to him, not as memory, but as fact. Cold air falls, damp air creeps, and old stonework always tells you where men once wanted air to pass. His father had worked in the quarry. His father had known that stone was not one thing, but many things, layers, seams, fractures, cavities. His father had pressed Milo's palm against a quarry wall and then against the soil beside it and said, "Stone lies. Earth tells the truth. Stone gives you back whatever temperature the air puts in. Earth keeps its own weather." Milo did not understand the cellar yet. He did not even know there was a cellar. He understood only that Needle had found a way to go where it was not so cold, and that the air coming from the gap smelled like earth, not hay. A cat does not lie about warmth. A cat goes where survival is easiest. The next morning, Milo watched Needle emerge from the same gap. The cat's fur was dry. Its paws were clean. No mud, no manure. And when Milo placed his hand on Needle's side, the cat was warm. Not stove warm, not fire warm, but warm the way a living thing is warm when it has not spent the night fighting 20 below air through inch-wide cracks. Milo had no plan yet, but he had a question, and the question was more dangerous and more useful than any plan. What was down there? The risk was not small. If the gap led to a shallow crawl space filled with rubble, he would waste time he could spend insulating the loft. If he pulled the wrong stone, the foundation might shift, and August would beat him or send him back to the county. If the space below held foul air, gas from decomposing soil, or methane from an old deposit, he could die faster than the cold would kill him, but the loft was killing him slowly. He knew this the way you know a fever is rising. Not by the number on a thermometer, but by the way your own body begins to feel like a stranger's. His fingers took longer to open each morning. His cough had deepened from a rattle to a bark. The frost on the inside of the blanket was thicker every dawn, and one morning he woke to find his eyelashes frozen shut, and he had to breathe into his cupped hands and press the warmth against his eyes until they opened. If the loft was certain death, then uncertain danger was a better gamble. He waited for August to leave for the Raish farm to borrow a saw blade. He waited for Lenora to go inside after the morning feeding. Then he knelt at the foundation gap and began to work. He had no tools except the folding rule and a broken harness buckle he had found in the hay. The buckle was brass, bent in a U-shape, and he used it to scrape at the mortar around one of the smaller packing stones. A piece no larger than his fist wedged between two fieldstones. The mortar was old, sandy, and had crumbled in places on its own. It came away in gritty strips that fell into the gap like dry sand. The packing stone loosened after 20 minutes of scraping. He pulled it free and set it beside him. The gap widened by 3 inches. Not enough for his hand. Not enough for anything except a better view of the darkness behind the wall. He pressed his face to the opening and inhaled. The air was stronger now. Damp, mineral, carrying the faintest trace of something old and sweet. Fermented grain, maybe, or rotted wood. It was the smell of a place that had been closed a long time. And then Needle pushed past him, flowed through the wider gap like water through a pipe, and vanished. Anton Pexa arrived at the Brunner farm on the 6th day. He came to sharpen hay knives, a job he did for $1 a meal, traveling between farms with a leather roll of files and a hand-cranked grindstone strapped to a pack frame on his back. He was 63 years old, Czech-born, and had hands that told a different story from the rest of him. His right hand was thick-fingered and sure. His left hand was curled inward, the last 2 fingers frozen at the second joint, damaged years ago in an accident he described differently depending on who asked. He had been a brick mason. He had built creamery cellars, dairy cool rooms, and spa à seigneur during Prohibition. He had repaired and sealed and ventilated underground rooms that no one was supposed to know about. He had walked away from that work in 1933 when the need ended and had survived since then by sharpening tools, repairing flues, and knowing how to make himself useful enough to be fed. Anton found Milo at the South Foundation. The boy was crouched, pressing a straw stem into the gap between the stones and watching the straw tremble. The air was moving the straw, slowly but moving it. Anton set down his pack frame. He did not ask what Milo was doing. He crouched beside him, slowly because his knees were old and the cold made them worse, and placed his damaged left hand near the gap. He held it there for 10 seconds. Then he pulled it back and looked at Milo. "That is not a mouse hole," Anton said. "That is a throat." Milo said, "The cat goes through." Anton said, "The cat is smarter than the house." He asked no other questions. Instead, he taught. He picked up a knife handle from his sharpening roll and tapped the foundation stone above the gap. The sound was flat, dead, solid. He moved the handle 2 inches right and tapped again. The sound was higher, thinner, with a faint ring behind it, hollow. "Listen," Anton said. He tapped again. Flat, tap, hollow, tap, flat. "Stone tells you where nothing is if you know how to hear it." He showed Milo how to smell the difference between stale air, which meant a sealed pocket, possibly dangerous, and living earth, which meant a space that was breathing connected to the surface somewhere, cycling air slowly enough to hold temperature. The air from the gap smelled like living earth. He showed Milo how to pry a fieldstone without collapsing the wall above it, not by pulling, by identifying the packing stones, the small pieces wedged between the main stones to fill gaps, and removing them first, one at a time, starting from the bottom. "A wall stands on its smallest pieces," Anton said. "Remove them carefully, and the big stones settle. Remove them carelessly, and everything falls." He did not ask why Milo needed to know these things. He looked at the boy's cracked hands, at the frost in his eyebrows, at the horse blanket stiff with frozen breath in the loft above. He looked at the house, where smoke rose from the stovepipe and no one came to check on the child in the barn. He understood the situation the way a mason understands a cracked wall, by reading the lines of stress and knowing where the failure would come. Before he left, Anton said one more thing. He said it quietly, leaning close so that only Milo could hear, even though they were alone. "Old men built bad rooms under barns during the liquor years. Barns hid the noise and the traffic. Some of those rooms were bricked. Some were dug and shored with wood. The bricked ones may still be standing. The wood ones may not. If you find a room, lower a candle before you lower yourself. If the candle dies, do not enter. If it burns, the air is still moving. Do you understand?" Milo said, "Yes." Anton said, "And if you find one, tell no one but me." He shouldered his pack frame and walked to the house to collect his dollar and his meal. From the kitchen window, Lenora watched the old check with the crippled hand, and she told August that the knife man had been talking to the boy again. August said, "Let him talk. The boy has nothing worth hearing." Martha Reich saw Milo crossing the yard that evening, carrying a bent pry bar he had found under a fallen board behind the tool shed. The bar was rusted, a foot long, and weighed almost nothing. It was barely a tool. But Martha saw it, and she stopped at the fence line. "What do you need a pry bar for?" she said. Milo said, "Loose stone." Martha said, "A loose stone will not make a bed." Milo said nothing. He walked to the barn. Behind him, Martha shook her head and pulled her coat tighter against the wind that was coming from the north, the wind that had not stopped in 4 days and would not stop for another 12. That night, Milo lay in the loft and watched Needle return from below. The cat emerged from the gap, jumped onto a hay bale, and began to clean its paws. Its whiskers were damp, its fur was dry, its paws were clean. Milo reached down and touched the cat's side. Warm. He looked at the frost on his blanket. He looked at his hands cracked across every knuckle, 2 fingertips numb enough that he could no longer feel the brass joints of his father's folding rule. He looked at the dark gap in the foundation where the air smelled of earth instead of winter. He had one candle stub given to him by Anton under the pretense of needing light for the loft. He had a length of twine from the harness repair box. He had his father's folding rule. He had a broken harness buckle. He had Martha's mittens. And he had a question that the loft could not answer and the cold would not wait for. In the morning, he would begin. The gossip started before Milo pulled the first stone. Lenora told the storekeeper's wife that the county orphan had queer habits and watched the barn wall instead of finishing his chores. She said it the way people say things they want, repeated, loudly, in a place where repetition was guaranteed. August amplified it. He told 2 men at the feed store that the boy was simple, maybe touched in the head by grief, the kind of child who stared at rocks and forgot to break the trough ice until the cattle bawled. He said it with the particular confidence of a man who has already decided that the boy's strangeness justifies whatever treatment he provides. At church, the German Lutheran service held in a cold room above the general store because the church building stove had cracked. Martha Reich said she had seen the boy kneeling beside the barn foundation as though he were praying to a wall. She said it not with malice, but with the blunt bewilderment of a woman who had survived 40 Minnesota winters by doing sensible things and could not understand a child who did peculiar ones. Milo heard none of this directly, but he saw it in the way Lenora stopped telling him when supper was ready and simply set a plate on the porch step. He saw it in the way the feed store owner's boy threw a frozen clod of horse manure at him when he walked past. He saw it in the way Jonas Klinkner, when he returned for his 2-week check, looked at Milo with the careful expression of a man who is deciding whether a problem is worth the paperwork. The social cost was total. He had no ally inside the house. He had no defender in the community. He had no authority that recognized his intelligence. The county saw him as a line item. The Bruners saw him as labor that slept in the outbuilding. The neighbors saw him as a strange child whose grief had made him odd. The only living thing that gave him useful information was a gray cat with a split ear. August escalated on the 9th day. He came into the barn while Milo was working the pry bar along the mortar line of a second packing stone. The stone was almost free. Another 10 minutes and Milo would have had it out. Instead, he heard boots on the floor below and shoved the pry bar behind a post and put his body in front of the gap. August looked at him. August looked at the foundation. He said, "What are you doing down here?" Milo said, "Checking for drafts." August crossed the barn floor in 4 strides and took Milo by the coat front and shoved him against a stall post hard enough that the post vibrated and a dusting of chaff fell from the beam above. August's face was close. His breath smelled of coffee and tobacco. His eyes were the eyes of a man who was not angry at a child, but at something behind the child, something older and more dangerous. "You damage my foundation, county boy," August said, "and I will put you under it." Milo said nothing. He had learned in the county home and in the quarry and in the 6 days since his mother's funeral that denial only tells a violent man there is something worth finding. Silence was safer. Silence gave nothing away. August released him. He looked at the foundation one more time. A long look, the kind of look a man gives to something he does not want examined. And then he left. Milo's hands were shaking, not from the cold. Anton came 2 days later, under the excuse of checking a cracked stovepipe fitting in the Brunner kitchen. It was a real job. The pipe joint had been leaking smoke for a week, but Anton priced it low enough that August could not refuse, and he stretched the work long enough to spend an hour in the barn. He found Milo sitting with his back to the foundation, his cracked hands resting on his knees, the pry bar hidden in the straw above. "He caught you," Anton said. Milo said, "He caught the bar. He did not find the gap." Anton sat beside him. He did not speak for a while. The barn was cold enough that their breath hung between them like a veil neither could see through. Then Anton said, "His brother built something under this barn. During the liquor years, August knows it is there. He does not want anyone else to know." Milo said, "Why?" Anton said, "Because a hidden room built to break the law is not a thing a man wants inspected, and because what is under a man's barn belongs to the man who owns the barn. If the county finds it, there will be questions. August does not want questions." This was the piece Milo had not understood. August was not protecting a barn. He was protecting a secret. And the secret was not the room itself, but the fact that the room existed, and August had never reported it, never opened it, never dealt with whatever was inside. As long as it stayed hidden, it was not his problem. The moment someone found it, it became his problem. Milo said, "I need it." Anton said, "I know." Anton reached into his coat and took out a stub of candle, half used, and a length of twine long enough to stretch 20 feet. He set them beside Milo. "Lower the flame first," he said. "If it dies, do not enter. If it burns, the air is still alive." He paused. "And if you find a room, mark every stone you move with chalk. If you cannot replace them in order, the wall will tell what you have done." He stood up. His knees cracked. He put his damaged hand on Milo's shoulder, the hand that could not grip but could still press, still warm, still touch. And he said, "I cannot come every day, but I will come when I can." He left. Milo sat alone in the barn with a candle stub, a length of twine, his father's folding rule, a broken harness buckle, and a question that was now, for the first time, larger than the fear. The next morning, before the light came up, before August stirred, before the cattle began to shift and the trough ice thickened past what a boy could break with a fence post, Milo knelt at the south foundation and began to work the second packing stone free. Needle watched from the hay bale, ears forward, split tip sharp against the dark. Outside, the wind pushed against the north wall. Inside, the air from the gap touched Milo's knuckles, steady and damp and patient. He had 12 days until the cold front that would decide everything. He did not know that yet, but the stones knew, and the cat knew. And somewhere beneath the frozen ground, the hidden room waited the way earth waits, without hurry, without judgment, holding its own weather in the dark. If you have ever noticed something small that everyone else ignored, something an animal did, something a wall said, something the ground told you when nobody was listening, tell us about it in the comments. Milo removed 3 packing stones by the end of the 10th day. Each was no bigger than a potato, wedged between the larger fieldstones like teeth in a jaw. He scraped the mortar with the harness buckle, working in the gray hour before dawn when August was still in the house and the barn held only cattle, mice, and needle. The mortar was old enough to crumble under brass. Whoever had mixed it had used too much sand, or the years had leached the calcium out, or both. It came away in dry strips that fell into the gap and vanished without sound, which told Milo the space behind the wall was not shallow. The gap was now wide enough for Needle to pass without pressing. The cat slipped through each night at the coldest hour and returned each morning dry, clean, and warm. Milo could fit his arm to the elbow. He could feel the air on his skin, steady, damp, carrying the mineral smell of packed earth and old brick. Not warm, but not the air that was splitting his fingertips and freezing his breath to the blanket. He could not fit through. His shoulders were too wide by 4 inches. He needed to remove at least one fieldstone, and fieldstones were not packing stones. They were heavy, load-bearing, and mortared on all sides. Moving one without shifting the wall above it required shoring, and shoring required wood, knowledge, and time. The temperature outside fell below -20 on the 11th day. Milo knew because Martha Reich's thermometer was nailed to her fence post, and he could read it from the road when he walked past carrying water. The mercury sat in the bulb like something that had given up trying to rise. His toes burned inside his boots, then went numb, and the numbness climbed to his ankles before he reached the barn. He rubbed his feet with straw until feeling returned, and the feeling was pain, and the pain was proof that the tissue was still alive. He could not wait for Anton. Anton came when he could, under excuses that were growing thin. But the cold was not waiting, and Milo's body was keeping a ledger that would close before spring. Anton returned on the 12th day, carrying a stovepipe elbow he claimed August had ordered. August had not ordered it, but the price was low enough, and the need plausible enough that August led him into the barn to measure the fitting. It bought Anton 40 minutes. He found Milo in the gap, arm deep, scraping mortar from a fieldstone the size of a small pig. The stone was wedged between 2 larger ones, and the mortar on its top edge was still holding. Anton did not waste time on greetings. He pulled 2 scrapboards from the kindling pile, short pieces, each about 18 inches, and showed Milo how to make a triangle brace. He set the boards against the stones above the one Milo was loosening, forming a wedge that would transfer the weight sideways instead of down. The triangle held the load the way a door frame holds a wall, by redirecting force to the sides. A wall does not fall because you remove a stone, Anton said. It falls because the stones above it have nowhere to go. Give them somewhere to go, and the wall stays. He showed Milo how to mark each removed stone with a stub of chalk, a line on the face, a number on the back, so that the stones could be replaced in exact order. If you cannot put them back the way they came out, anyone who looks will see what you have done. A wall remembers its own shape. Respect that. He demonstrated the wedging technique, not pulling the fieldstone outward, which would drag the mortar line and risk cracking the stones above, but pressing it sideways, shifting it a 1/4 inch at a time along its bed until the mortar broke on all 4 edges. Patience, not force. Anton's damaged left hand could not grip the stone, but he guided Milo's hands with his right, correcting the angle, adjusting the pressure. "You're not fighting the wall," Anton said. "You are asking it a question. The answer takes time." Milo worked for 30 minutes. The fieldstone shifted a full inch. The triangle brace held. The stones above settled a fraction, and a thin rain of sand fell from the mortar line, and then everything was still. Anton checked the brace. He checked the mortar lines above and below. He nodded. Then he gave Milo 2 more things. A stub of candle, shorter than the first, already lit once, and a lesson. "Lower the flame on the twine," he said. "Let it hang in the gap, just past the stone. If the flame burns steady, the air is moving and the room is breathing. If it gutters and dies, there is no draft, and a room without draft will hold bad air. Do not enter a room where the candle dies." "Do you understand?" Milo said. What if the flame just gets smaller? Anton said, Then the air is thin, not poison, but not enough. You can enter for a short time, but not to sleep. A man who sleeps in thin air does not wake up. He shouldered his pack frame. At the barn door, he stopped. If August locks the tool shed, he said, use what you have. A folding rule is a lever. A buckle is a scraper. Straw is insulation. Do not wait for the right tool. Use the tool you hold. He left. Milo heard August's voice from the house, sharp and questioning, and Anton's voice, low and easy, talking about stovepipe gauges and flue draft, as though he had not just taught a 12-year-old boy how to dismantle a wall without collapsing it. The first setback came that night. Milo lowered the candle on the twine, easing it past the loosened fieldstone into the dark space behind the wall. The flame burned for 3 seconds, guttered, shrank to a blue ring around the wick, and died. No draft. The air behind the wall was not moving. Milo pulled the candle back and sat against the foundation. The cold pressed against his back through his coat, through his shirt, through the skin and muscle, and into the spine itself. He had risked everything. August's violence, the foundation's stability, the hours of scraping that had left his fingers raw, and the room behind the wall could not breathe. He did not sleep that night. He lay in the loft, wrapped in the stiff blanket, and thought about air. Anton had said a room needs a low inlet and a high outlet. The gap in the foundation was the low inlet. But where was the high outlet? Without it, the cellar was sealed. A pocket of stale air trapped beneath the barn, holding whatever gases the earth produced and whatever mold the darkness grew. Needle did not seem bothered. The cat went through the gap at midnight and returned before dawn, warm and dry. Cats breathe less than boys. Cats are smaller. Cats need less air. But Needle had been doing this for weeks, maybe longer, and the cat was not dead, which meant air was entering the space from somewhere, just not from the gap Milo had opened. He thought about this for 2 days. He watched Needle enter. He watched Needle leave. He watched the straw stem tremble in the gap, proving that air was moving, even if the candle could not stay lit. The movement was too weak for flame, but strong enough for straw. On the 14th day, he found the answer. He followed Needle's tracks in the thin snow that had drifted inside the barn. The cat's paw prints led to the foundation gap, disappeared, and then on the outside of the barn, near the manure ramp on the east side, reappeared. Faint prints, almost erased by wind, emerged from a spot where a clay drain pipe stuck out of the foundation 2 inches above the frozen ground. The pipe was 4 inches across, cracked along its length, clogged with frozen dirt and old straw. But it was not sealed. Air moved through it. Milo could see it, a faint shimmer in the cold, the way heat rises from a road in summer, except this was moisture leaving the ground and condensing in the frozen air above. The drain was the outlet, or rather, it had been designed as a drain for what, Milo did not know yet, and had become, by accident and neglect, the high vent that kept the underground space breathing. Needle entered through the low foundation gap and exited through the drain or the reverse. The air path was complete. It was just too narrow and too clogged to support a candle flame. Milo spent an hour clearing the drain with a stick. Frozen dirt came out in plugs. Old straw came out in wads. A dead mouse, stiff as leather, came out and landed on the snow. He pushed the stick through until he felt it break into open air on the other side, and when he pulled it back, the stick was damp and warm to the touch. That evening, he tried the candle again. He lowered it through the gap on the twine, past the loosened fieldstone into the dark. The flame burned. It wavered, leaned slightly toward the drain side, and burned steady. The air was moving. The room was breathing. Milo pulled the candle back and pressed his forehead against the cold stone. His body was shaking, and he did not know if it was cold or relief or fear of what came next. The second setback came from August. On the 15th day, August locked the tool shed with a padlock and put the key in his coat pocket. He did not explain why. He did not need to. He had seen Milo with the pry bar. He had seen the boy's interest in the foundation. He could not know what Milo had found, but he could remove the tools that might find more. Milo stood in front of the locked shed for a full minute, his breath smoking in the air, his fingers curled inside Martha's mittens. Then he went to the barn and picked up his father's folding rule and the broken harness buckle. The folding rule was brass jointed and 24 inches long. Fully extended, it was a lever. Folded at the midpoint, it was a wedge. The harness buckle was a scraper, a pry, and, if pressed flat against a mortar line and struck with a stone, a crude chisel. He went back to the fieldstone. He wedged the folding rule into the mortar gap on the left side and pressed. The rule bent. He eased off, repositioned, and pressed again, slower. The stone shifted a quarter inch. He moved to the right side and repeated. Quarter inch, left. Quarter inch, right. His hands split. The skin across his knuckles, already cracked from cold and work, opened in two places, and blood ran over the brass and froze on the buckle in dark lines. He wrapped his hands in strips torn from the flour sack that had held his clothes and kept working. By evening, the fieldstone had moved 3 inches. By the next dawn, it had moved 5. By the 17th day, the stone was loose enough to slide, and Milo braced his feet against the frozen floor, gripped the stone with both hands wrapped in flour sack strips, and pulled. The stone came free. It weighed more than he expected, 40 pounds, maybe 50, and he nearly dropped it on his feet. He set it down beside the wall and looked into the hole. Darkness. Complete underground darkness, the kind that has weight and texture, the kind that pushes back against your eyes. And air rising from the hole like breath from a sleeping mouth. Damp, mineral, alive. The hole was shoulder wide. Just. The third setback nearly ended everything. On the 17th night, Lenora counted blankets. She came into the barn, which she rarely did, and looked at Milo's loft space and saw the horse blanket and a second blanket, a thin cotton quilt Milo had found buried in the hay, forgotten or discarded, stained with oil and smelling of mice, but still a layer between his body and the cold. Lenora took the quilt. She said it was hers. She said Milo had been given one blanket, and one blanket was what the county provided. She carried it to the house and did not look back. Milo lay that night with one blanket, the flour sack strips wrapped around his hands, Martha's mittens on his feet because his boots were too frozen to wear, and the cold coming through the loft boards like water through a sieve. He could feel his body consuming itself, the shivering that would not stop, the hunger that sat behind his ribs like a fist, the cough that tore at his throat every time he breathed deep enough to fill his lungs. The gamble was no longer a choice. The loft would kill him. The question was whether the cellar would kill him faster. Unexpected help arrived the next morning, disguised as indifference. Martha Reich left a feed sack of old newspapers outside the barn door. She told Lenora it was for the calf bedding. She placed it where Milo would find it before anyone else did. She did not look at the boy. She did not speak to him. She set the sack down and walked away, and the only sign that she knew what she was doing was the way she placed it, not by the calf pen, but by the south wall, near the foundation, near the gap. Martha was not convinced. She was not converted, but she had begun to worry, and worry in a practical woman takes the shape of action rather than words. Milo entered the cellar on the 18th day. He tied the twine to a post at the entrance, lit the candle stub, and lowered himself through the gap feet first. His coat caught on the stone edge. He exhaled to flatten his chest and push through, scraping his ribs against the fieldstone, tearing the coat lining. For 3 seconds he was stuck, shoulders through, hips caught, and the darkness below him was absolute, and the cold above him was absolute, and he was pinned between two kinds of death with a candle in one hand and a cat somewhere below making a sound that was not a meow but a low, steady purr. He twisted his hips. The coat fabric tore. He dropped 3 feet onto packed earth and landed on his hands and knees. The candle showed him walls, brick walls, not fieldstone, not packed earth, but laid brick, old red-orange, mortared in courses that were rough but deliberate. The ceiling was low, 5 feet at the center, dropping to 4 at the edges. The room was perhaps 8 feet by 10. Empty shelves lined 2 walls, the wood dark with age and damp. On the floor, broken stoneware jugs, a rusted funnel, shards of glass, a wooden rack collapsed into a pile of slats. The smell was strong now, mineral, damp, and beneath it the faint sweetness of old fermented grain, the ghost of whatever had been stored here when storing it was illegal. The air was not warm, but it was not the air in the loft. It did not move. It did not cut. It sat against Milo's skin like still water, and the difference between this air and the air above was the difference between a river and a stone. One in motion, relentless, stealing everything it touched, and the other still, patient, holding what it had. He found the second chamber at the far wall. A plank door collapsed inward, blocked by a pile of fallen brick and old mortar. He could not enter it, but he could feel the air coming from behind it, warmer, damper, deeper. The cellar breathed from 2 lungs. The outer chamber was cooler, closer to the entrance. The inner chamber, behind the collapsed door, was the warmest pocket. He placed his hand on the inner brick wall. The temperature was steady even, without the fluctuations of above-ground air. Later, when Anton brought a thermometer, a dairy thermometer in a tin case, borrowed from the Reich Creamery, it would read 51 degrees near the inner wall, 46 near the entrance, and when Milo cleared enough brick to reach the second chamber, 55 degrees at the deepest point. 55 degrees was not comfort. It was not a stove. It was not a heated room. But 55 degrees was the difference between a body that could maintain itself and a body that could not. Above ground, in the loft, the temperature was 20 below zero and falling. The difference was 75 degrees. The difference was life. Needles sat on a brick ledge, watching Milo with eyes that reflected the candle flame like 2 small coins. The cat had been sleeping here for weeks. The cat had solved the problem that was killing the boy, and it had solved it the way cats solve everything, by ignoring human opinion and following warmth. Milo sat on the packed earth floor, his back against the brick, and for the first time in 18 days, he stopped shaking. Over the next 3 days, Milo built a system. Not a home. A system. The minimum architecture required to survive below ground without dying of cold, bad air, or discovery. He moved the entrance stones so they could be slid back into place from inside. He packed straw around the crawl gap to reduce visible disturbance. He cleared the clay drain of remaining debris, pushing a willow switch through the length of the pipe to keep the airway open. He layered newspapers under a dry shelf board to create a sleeping surface off the packed earth. He strung the twine from the entrance to the inner chamber wall so he could navigate in total darkness without the candle, which was now less than an inch of wax and had to be rationed to emergencies. He worked in the gray hours, before dawn, after dark. He carried materials 1 handful at a time, straw in his coat, newspaper in his shirt, a scrapboard under his arm. He moved slowly, deliberately, replacing the entrance stones each time he left, brushing snow over his tracks near the foundation. August must not know. August must never know. The early performance data appeared through action, not measurement. Milo left a tin cup of water in the loft. Within an hour, a skin of ice covered the surface. He left a second cup in the cellar. The next morning, the water was still liquid. He breathed in the loft and saw his breath hang in the air like smoke. He breathed in the deep chamber and saw nothing. The air swallowed his breath the way warm air swallows warm breath, without trace. Needles slept on the brick ledge every night. Milo slept on the newspaper-covered shelf board, wrapped in the horse blanket and Martha's feed sack, and woke without frost on his eyelashes for the first time since arriving at the Brunner farm. Jonas Klinkner returned for his scheduled check on the 21st day. He came on the same slate-colored horse, wearing the same long coat, carrying the same notebook. He climbed the loft ladder and found the straw pile, the single blanket, the flour sack strips stained brown with dried blood. He came down and found August in the cow stall. He asked about the boy's condition. August said the boy was stubborn as a frozen hinge, and that he ate well and worked poorly and had no complaints worth repeating. Klinkner found Milo outside, breaking trough ice. He looked at the boy's cracked lips. He looked at the flour sack wrappings on his hands. He looked at the coat, torn along the right side, the lining hanging loose. "Are you being fed?" he asked, Milo terrified of losing even barn shelter, because without the barn he could not reach the cellar, and without the cellar he would die, said, "Yes, sir." Klinkner wrote in his notebook. He said he would return in 2 weeks. He mounted the horse and rode south, and Milo watched him go and understood that the county would not save him. The county had rules and schedules and notebooks, and none of those things produced heat. That evening, Martha Reich told her hired hand, Nels Assen, that she had heard the radio forecast at the store. A cold front was building over the Dakotas, the worst of the winter, temperatures expected to drop past 30 below, possibly past 40 below in exposed areas. The front would arrive within 4 days. Nels said he had lived through cold before. Martha said this was not cold. This was the kind that killed horses standing up. The news traveled the way news travels in farming country, not through newspapers or telegrams, but through voices at feed stores, through women talking across fence lines, through men who rode between farms and carried information the way they carried tools, as things too useful to leave behind. By the 22nd day, every farm in the township was preparing. August bought coal on credit from the store in town. Martha stacked hay bales against her north wall. The Vosen Creamery shut down its delivery route. The schoolroom closed. Milo heard the forecast from Lenora, who said it to August in the kitchen while Milo ate his plate of boiled potatoes on the porch step. 30 below? Maybe 40. 4 days. He went to the barn. He checked the entrance stones. He checked the clay drain, pushing the willow switch through until air moved freely. He checked the newspaper bedding, the shelf board, the twine line from entrance to inner chamber. He checked the water cup, still liquid. Anton arrived the next day, unannounced, on foot. He carried no tools, no excuse. He walked into the barn and found Milo and said, "Show me." Milo showed him. Anton went through the gap, slowly, painfully, his damaged hand scraping on the stone, and stood in the outer chamber with the candle burning steady and his breath invisible in the 51-degree air. He put his good hand on the brick wall. He tapped it. He listened. He said, "Creamery brick." Someone knew what they were building. He checked the mortar joints. He checked the ceiling boards, rough-cut planks, supported by 2 beams that were still sound. He checked the clay drain from inside, feeling the airflow against his curled fingers. Then he told Milo the worst danger. "A warm underground room can save you," he said. "But if snow blocks the drain, or if someone seals the stones from outside, this room becomes a box. A box with no air is a coffin. You must keep the vent clear. Use the willow switch. Check it every time you enter. And leave the entrance stones loose enough that you can push them out from inside if you must." He showed Milo how to arrange the stones so they could be displaced by a hard shove from the cellar side. Not mortared, not wedged, balanced, so they looked solid from outside but could be pushed by a boy's weight from inside. Anton climbed back out. In the barn, he stood for a moment, breathing hard from the effort. His damaged hand was bleeding where the stone had scraped it. He wiped the blood on his coat. "I cannot come during the worst of it," he said. "The road will not be passable. You will be alone." Milo said, "I know." Anton said, "The candle is almost gone. Do not waste it. Learn the room in the dark. Learn where every wall is, every shelf, every brick. Your hands will see for you." He put his good hand on Milo's head. Not a pat, not a gesture, but a weight, a pressure, a thing that said, "I recognize you." And then he walked out of the barn and into the white afternoon. Milo watched him cross the field until the old man's dark coat dissolved into the snow and the distance and the flat gray sky. The cold came on the 24th day. It did not arrive like weather. It arrived like a verdict. The temperature dropped past 20 below before noon. By dusk, the mercury on Martha's fence post thermometer had sunk past the lowest mark and sat in the bulb like something drowned. Nails popped in the barn boards with sounds like pistol shots, sharp, spaced, startling the cattle into wide-eyed silence. The pump handle outside the Brunner house froze to the iron casing, and when August tried to work it, the skin of his palm stuck to the metal and tore when he pulled away. He wrapped his hand in a rag and cursed, and went inside. The world contracted. Sound carried differently, sharper, thinner, as though the air had tightened around every noise and squeezed it to a point. The cattle bawled because the trough water froze faster than Milo could break it. He swung the fence post until his shoulders screamed, and the ice reformed behind him like a wound closing. The manure froze in the stalls and had to be chipped, not shoveled. The barn doors stuck in their tracks. A leather harness hanging on a nail cracked when Milo brushed it with his elbow. The cold was not absence of heat. It was a presence, a force, a thing that entered wood and metal and flesh and took what it wanted. Inside the Brunner house, the coal stove burned all day. August fed it every 2 hours. The stovepipe glowed dull orange at the first joint. Frost formed on the inside of the windows and did not melt. Frost formed in the corners of the kitchen ceiling where the insulation had settled and the boards were exposed to the attic air above. Lenora put a blanket over the north-facing window, and the blanket stiffened with ice on the glass side within an hour. The house was losing. The stove was winning, but barely, and the coal bin was emptying at a rate that August could calculate, and that calculation made him savage. He came to the barn at dusk and found Milo wrapped in the horse blanket in the loft, shaking. August said, "Break the trough at 5. If it is frozen at 6, no supper." He left. He did not offer coal. He did not offer a lamp. He did not offer the kitchen floor. He walked back to the house where the stove burned and the windows frosted, and his wife cooked potatoes in a kitchen that was 43 degrees at the ceiling and 29 degrees at the floor, and he closed the door. The first complication came at midnight. August, crossing the yard for a reason Milo could not determine, checking the cattle, maybe, or checking the locks, noticed something at the south foundation, a stone out of alignment. A shadow where a shadow should not be. He did not investigate closely. He was cold and angry, and the wind was cutting across the yard with enough force to push a grown man sideways. But he kicked. He kicked loose snow and frozen manure against the foundation, packing the gaps, sealing the cracks. Not because he knew what was behind them, but because he had been told years ago by his brother that the foundation should stay sealed, and because anything the boy was interested in was something August wanted blocked. The snow and frozen manure packed against the entrance stones. Not enough to seal them completely, but enough to narrow the gap by half. Enough that Milo, from the loft, heard the scraping and the kicking and felt the terror climb his spine like a cold hand rising vertebra by vertebra. The second complication came an hour later. Needle did not return. Milo lay in the loft, shaking, listening for the familiar scrape-click-thump of the cat passing through the foundation gap. The sound did not come. Instead, faintly, from below the barn floor, he heard scratching. Intermittent, rhythmic, desperate scratching, the sound of claws on stone, the sound of an animal trying to get through a gap that had been narrowed by 6 inches of frozen debris. Needle was inside the cellar. The cat had entered before August kicked the entrance shut. Now the cat could not get out, and if the clay drain was blocked by the same debris, if August's kicking had packed snow against the drain pipe as well, the cellar was sealed. Sealed with the cat inside. Sealed with the only living thing that had shown Milo how to survive, now trapped in the space that was supposed to save them both. The third complication came with Lenora's voice. She opened the barn door at 2 a.m. and shouted into the dark. The cattle trough, the ice. Break it now. She did not say please. She did not offer a lantern. She shouted and closed the door and the cold that entered the barn. In the 3 seconds the door was open, hit Milo like a wall of water. He climbed down the loft ladder. His fingers would not close properly around the rungs. He crossed the barn floor, each step a negotiation between his body and the cold, and went outside. The night was clear. The stars were hard and white and looked close enough to cut himself on. The cold was beyond measurement, beyond language, beyond the ability of a 12-year-old body to process as information. It was not temperature. It was violence. It entered his lungs and his lungs spasmed. It touched his face and his face went numb in seconds. It found the tear in his coat and pressed through it like a blade through cloth. He broke the trough ice. He swung the fence post 7 times. Each swing took more effort than the last. The ice was thicker than he had ever seen it, 2 inches, maybe 3. And when it shattered, it sounded like a pane of glass dropped on a stone floor. The cattle came to drink. Their breath rose in clouds that froze and fell as crystals that caught the starlight as they drifted down. Milo walked back to the barn. He could not feel his feet. He could not feel his hands. He could feel his chest, where the cough sat like a closed fist, and he could feel his eyes, which were watering and freezing simultaneously, and he could feel the place inside his skull where thoughts formed, and the thoughts were slow, thick, drifting. The kind of thoughts that come when a body begins to choose between functions and shuts down the ones it cannot afford. He was hypothermic. He did not know the word. He knew the feeling. The feeling was sweet. The feeling was an invitation to lie down in the straw and close his eyes and let the shaking stop. The shaking was the worst part. If the shaking would stop, he could sleep. If he could sleep, everything would be fine. He stood in the barn, swaying, and looked at the south foundation. The scratching was still there, Needle behind the stones clawing at the gap. Stay with this story, because what happens in the next few minutes decides whether the hidden room saves the boy or seals him in. Milo knelt at the foundation. His fingers would not work. He pulled Martha's mittens off with his teeth and pressed his bare hands against the packed snow and frozen manure that August had kicked against the stones. The debris was hard. His fingernails bent against it. He dug with the harness buckle, scraping, chipping, pulling frozen clods away one by one. The buckle slipped. He grabbed it again. The buckle slipped again, and this time his fingers did not close around it, and he had to press the buckle against his palm with his other hand and hold both hands together like a prayer around the brass. 2 fingernails tore. He felt it, a distant, blunted pain, like a sound heard through a wall. Blood came, dark in the starlight from the barn's cracked boards, and froze on the buckle in thin lines. The entrance stones appeared. The packing snow fell away in chunks. He pushed the first stone inward. It scraped, resisted, then slid. The second stone followed. The gap opened, smaller than before, narrowed by debris he could not fully clear, but open. Damp air touched his face. Earth air, cellar air. The air that was 51 degrees near the wall and 46 near the entrance and 55 in the deep chamber behind the collapsed door. He went through feet first. His coat caught on the stone edge. The same place, the same snag, the same trapped moment as before. He exhaled. He flattened his chest. He twisted. The coat tore further, the lining ripping away from the outer shell, and he dropped into the darkness. He landed on packed earth. His knees buckled. He lay on the cellar floor, breathing, and the air that entered his lungs was not warm, but it was not the air that had been killing him, and his body knew the difference before his mind did. The shaking continued for a long time, 20 minutes, 30. But it was the shaking of a body that had been given a chance, not the shaking of a body that was shutting down. Needle found him in the dark. The cat pressed against his chest, purring, vibrating with a frequency that Milo felt in his ribs. He wrapped his arms around the cat and held it, and the cat's body heat transferred through the thin cloth of his shirt into the skin of his chest, and the warmth spread outward the way warmth spreads through cold water, slowly, unevenly, but moving. He crawled to the inner chamber. The collapsed door had been partially cleared on a previous visit, enough for him to squeeze past. The deeper room was smaller, 6 feet by 6, maybe Sikai, and the air was thicker, warmer, holding the heat of the earth around it the way a cupped hand holds water. He wrapped himself in the newspapers he had layered on the shelf board. He pulled the feed sack over his legs. He pressed his back against the brick wall that read 55 degrees on Anton's thermometer and felt the steady, ancient warmth of earth that had not frozen, that could not freeze, that had held its own temperature since before the barn was built, since before the cellar was dug, since before the cold came. He found dried apples in a sealed jar on the bottom shelf. Not many. A double handful, dark brown, leathery, tasting of sugar and dust. They were at least 3 years old, maybe older, sealed by someone during the liquor years for reasons Milo did not understand and did not care about. He ate 4. He gave Needle 1. The cat sniffed it, licked it, and went back to purring. Milo drank from melted frost that had collected in a cracked crock near the entrance. The water tasted of clay and iron. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. Above him, through the ceiling boards, he could hear the barn, the cattle shifting, the wind pressing against the north wall, the nails popping, and beyond the barn, the Brunner house, where the stove was devouring coal and losing the argument with the cold. The contrast above was collapsing. The Brunner stovepipe backdrafted in a wind gust, and smoke filled the kitchen. Lenora opened the east window to clear the air, and the cold entered so fast that the water pail on the counter frosted at the rim in under a minute. August overfired the stove to compensate, feeding it faster than the draft could sustain, and a fire brick cracked, a sound like a knuckle popping, followed by a thin line of red glow visible through the stove's seam. The cracked brick would still function, but the stove's efficiency dropped, and the coal that had been lasting 6 hours per load now lasted 4. August calculated. Lenora watched him calculate. The coal bin held enough for 3 days at the normal rate. At the new rate, it held enough for 2. After that, they would burn wood, and the woodpile was half what it should have been because August had not cut enough in October and November, and now the wood was frozen into a solid mass behind the house that would have to be chopped apart before it could be split. The house that had denied Milo a corner near the stove was now failing to keep its own occupants warm. The irony was not poetic, it was structural. August had invested in coal and stove and chimney, the furnace bill approach that Jonas Klinkner had endorsed, and the furnace bill was coming due, and the payment was more than the system could deliver. A quarter-mile south, the cold claimed its human cost. Nels Assen, Martha Reich's hired hand, decided before dawn that the coal supply at the Reich farm was too low. He would walk to the Vosen place 2 miles east and borrow 100 weight. He dressed in 2 coats, wrapped his face in a wool scarf, and started walking. He made it half a mile. The wind found the seam between his scarf and his collar. The cold entered his chest. His breathing shortened. His legs, which had carried him through 20 Minnesota winters, refused a 21st. He fell on the road between the Reich fence line and the Hollander Creek crossing, and the snow began to cover him the way snow covers everything, patiently, evenly, without malice or mercy. Martha found him because she saw the track stop. She and Anton, who had walked to her farm the day before and been unable to leave, dragged Nels into the summer kitchen and packed heated stones around his body. They boiled water. They rubbed his hands. They prayed in 2 languages. Nels survived, but his left foot turned black at 3 toes, and those toes would be gone by spring. The cold was not a metaphor. It was not a narrative device. It was a force that killed horses standing in their stalls and froze chickens on their roosts and took a man's toes for the crime of walking 2 miles on a February morning. And beneath the Brunner barn, 12 feet below the frozen ground, Milo Eater slept. His body temperature held. His breathing steadied. His shaking stopped. Needle lay across his chest, and the steady purr vibrated through the boy's ribs, and the dried apples sat in his stomach, and the brick wall pressed its 55 degrees into his back, and the earth held its own weather in the dark. Dawn came. Milo did not see it. In the cellar, there was no dawn. There was only the twine under his fingers leading to the entrance, and the air moving slowly through the clay drain, and the faint scratching of Needle's claws on the brick ledge. Above, the cold eased by 2 degrees, still below 30, but the wind shifted south and the killing edge dulled. Jonas Klinkner arrived at the Reich farm at mid-morning because Martha had sent word through the Vosen boy that Nels was injured. Klinkner came, assessed the situation, wrote in his notebook, and then asked about the other farms. Martha said, "Check the Brunner boy." Klinkner rode to the Brunner farm. He found August in the kitchen, nursing the cracked stove, burning the last of the coal reserve mixed with fence post scraps. He asked about Milo. August said the boy had run away. He said it without hesitation, without rehearsal, as though he had expected the question and prepared the answer. He said Milo had left during the night, probably trying to reach town, probably lying in a ditch somewhere. He said it was not his fault. He said, "You cannot keep a boy who does not want to stay." Klinkner looked at the barn. He looked at the loft. He found the straw pile, the single blanket, the flour sack strips. He found no boy. He walked outside and stood in the yard and looked at the snow, which told him nothing because the wind had erased every track. He was about to remount the horse when Anton arrived. Anton had walked from the Reich farm a quarter-mile through knee-deep drifts, his damaged hand tucked against his chest, his face wrapped in a strip of flour sacking. He came into the yard and looked at Klinkner and looked at August and said nothing. Then he looked at the south foundation. He looked at the stones. He saw the chalk marks, faint, half covered by kicked snow, but visible if you knew what to look for. He saw the clay drain on the east side, and from the drain, a thin wisp of vapor rising into the cold air. Moisture, warm moisture, condensing in air that was 30 below. A living thing was breathing down there. And then he saw the tracks, not human tracks, cat tracks, small, neat, four-toed prints emerging from the base of the drain pipe, crossing the snow to the manure pile and returning. Needle had found the exit route. Anton knelt at the foundation. He did not explain. He found the chalk-marked stones and pressed. The first stone shifted inward. The second followed. The gap opened. Klinkner said, "What is this?" Anton said, "The boy's answer." They pulled the stones out. Anton and Klinkner together, August standing behind them with an expression that was not concern for the child, but fear of what the opening would reveal. The gap widened. Light fell into the cellar for the first time since Milo had entered, a shaft of winter sun that cut through the darkness and landed on the packed earth floor. Milo was sitting against the inner wall, wrapped in newspapers and the feed sack, Needle on his lap. His face was dirty. His hands were wrapped in flour sack strips dark with blood. His coat was torn. His eyes, adjusting to the light, were squinted nearly shut. But he was alive. He was warm enough to speak. He was warm enough to move. He was warm enough that when Klinkner reached down and took his hand to help him up, the boy's skin was not the skin of a child who had spent the night in 30 below air. It was the skin of a child who had spent the night in 55-degree earth. Milo looked at Klinkner. He looked at Anton. He looked at August, whose face had gone the color of ash. He said, "The cat knew." Jonas Klinkner stood in the cellar for a long time. He had to crouch. The ceiling was too low for his full height, and the cold from his coat and boots radiated into the chamber air and made the space feel smaller than it was. But he stood there, his county badge catching the candle flame Anton had lit, and he looked at the brick walls, the shelves, the stoneware shards, the newspapers layered on the shelf board where Milo had slept. Then he placed his bare hand against the inner brick wall. He held it there for 10 seconds. 20. He pulled it away and placed the same hand against one of the barn boards visible through the entrance gap above. The difference was the difference between touching a living thing and touching a dead one. The brick held warmth the way skin holds warmth, steady, deep, from within. The barn board was so cold it hurt. Klinkner said, "I told you warmth came from fuel. I was wrong." He paused. He was not a man who revised his positions easily, and the effort showed in his face the way a cramp shows in a muscle. Some warmth is older than fuel. Milo, still sitting against the wall with Needle on his lap, said nothing. He did not need to. Anton crouched beside Klinkner and pointed out what the county man had missed, the mortar joint still holding after years, the clay drain providing air exchange, the low entrance, the high outlet, the breathing pattern that kept the space livable. He did not lecture. He pointed, and Klinkner looked, and the education happened in silence. Outside, August stood in the yard. He had not followed them into the cellar. He had not offered to help pull the stones. He stood with his arms at his sides and his face carrying an expression that was neither relief nor anger, but the particular blankness of a man watching a structure he had built. Not a physical structure, but a structure of secrecy, control, and denial, collapse one brick at a time. The measurable results arrived over the next 2 hours as word spread and neighbors came. The Brunner house stove had consumed nearly all remaining coal during the crisis night. August had burned fence posts, a broken chair, and part of a shelf to keep the fire going after the coal ran out. The kitchen temperature had dropped to 31 degrees at floor level despite the fire. Frost had formed on the inside walls. The cellar had used no fuel. The water cup on the shelf board was still liquid. The air temperature, measured by Anton's dairy thermometer, read 52 degrees in the inner chamber, 47 near the entrance. Milo's body temperature, assessed by Martha Reich when she arrived and placed her hand on his forehead, the way she assessed calves, without sentiment, with precision, was low but recovering. His extremities were cold but responsive. His cough was no better, but it was no worse. Anton said quietly to Klinkner, "If the boy had stayed in the loft, he would not have been alive when you arrived. The temperature up there was lower than the trough water." Martha came first after Klinkner. She came because she had sent the message about Nels, and because she had heard from the Vosen boy that the county man had gone to the Brunner farm, and because she was the kind of woman who walked toward trouble instead of away from it. She lowered herself through the entrance gap with more difficulty than the others. She was broader, and the gap had not been designed for adults, and stood in the outer chamber with her hands on her hips and her mouth slightly open. She looked at the brick walls. She looked at the shelves. She looked at the clay drain still breathing its thin plume of vapor. She looked at Needle, who sat on the brick ledge and looked back at her with the indifference cats reserve for people who have not yet proven useful. Martha said, "How does the air not go bad?" Anton said, "Ask the boy." Milo explained. He did not explain the way an adult explains, with qualifications, with caveats, with the language of expertise. He explained the way a child explains who has learned something by doing it. The low entrance pulls air in because cold air falls. The high drain lets air out because warm air rises. The space between them is the breathing room. If either one is blocked, the room dies. He showed her the willow switch he used to clear the drain. He showed her the chalk marks on the stones. He showed her the twine line from entrance to inner chamber. Martha listened the way she did everything, completely, without interruption, with the focus of a woman who evaluated information by its utility. When Milo finished, she said, "The newspapers were not for the calf bedding." Milo said, "No, ma'am." Martha said, "I know." She looked at the ceiling boards above her, which were the floor of the barn above, which was the building that had been killing a 12-year-old boy for 3 weeks. Who built this? The answer came from August, who had finally entered. Not through the gap. He would not lower himself to crawl, but by standing at the entrance and speaking down into the dark. His brother, he said. His brother and 2 neighbors, around 1927. They had bricked it with salvage from a dismantled creamery kiln. They had stored jugs and mash and fermented corn liquor through the last years of Prohibition. The room had been forgotten after the barn roof collapsed in 31, and the end of Prohibition made the whole enterprise pointless. August had known it was there. He had never opened it. He had never wanted to. Klinkner said, "You knew there was a habitable space beneath this barn, and you put a child in the loft." August said nothing. Martha said, "Property does not give a man permission to freeze a child." August said the cellar was his property and the boy was a trespasser, and the county had no right to inspect structures on private land without a warrant. He said it with the desperate precision of a man reaching for legal language because moral language had failed him. Klinkner wrote in his notebook, He wrote for a long time. Then he closed the notebook and said, I am recommending the boy's immediate removal from this placement. I am noting in the record that the foster home failed to provide adequate sleeping quarters, that a habitable space existed and was knowingly withheld, and that the child's survival was achieved through his own effort and not through the care of the placement family. August said, You cannot prove I knew. Anton said, You kicked snow against the entrance during the night. You tried to seal it. August looked at Anton. The look was the look of a man who has just discovered that the person he dismissed as harmless has been paying attention all along. Klinkner said, I do not need to prove what you knew, Brunner. I need to document what the child endured. The documentation speaks. The community came throughout the day. Not in a crowd, this was farm country, and crowds were luxuries no one could afford during a cold snap, but in ones and twos. The Vosen creamery operator who wanted to see the brick lining, a farmer named Detmer from the East Road who had lost 2 calves to the cold and wanted to know if underground rooms could save livestock. The Hollander woman whose husband was bedridden and whose root cellar had flooded in the fall, who asked Milo if he could tell her whether her cellar's foundation was sound by tapping the walls. Milo answered each question. He did not perform. He did not lecture. He demonstrated tapping stone, listening for hollow sounds, checking mortar, testing airflow with a straw stem. He spoke in short sentences, the way his father had spoken, the way Anton spoke, one fact at a time, each fact attached to an action. The boy who had been dismissed as simple now held knowledge that the adults needed, and the reversal was not comfortable for anyone. The adults shifted on their feet. They looked at each other. They looked at the 12-year-old boy with torn fingernails and flour sack bandages who had survived a night that had nearly killed a grown man on an open road. The innovation was not magic. It was not invention. It was observation applied to physics that had always been true. Earth below the frost line holds its temperature. Air moves from cold to warm, from low to high. An enclosed space with controlled ventilation will maintain a stable temperature regardless of the air above it. Every root cellar in the township operated on the same principle. Milo had not discovered a new law. He had applied an old one in a way that no one had thought to apply it, because no one had needed to, because no one else had been sleeping in a barn loft in 30 below weather with no stove and no blankets, and no adult willing to help. Jonas Klinkner removed Milo from the Brunner placement that afternoon. He wrote the order on the porch step, using his knee as a desk, while August watched from the kitchen window and Lenora stood in the doorway, neither objecting nor assisting. The county would investigate the placement conditions. The $4 monthly payment would cease. Milo's possessions, the flour sack of clothes, the folding rule, the harness buckle, Martha's mittens, were collected from the loft and the cellar and placed in a feed sack. Martha Reich took him. She did not volunteer warmly. She said, I have a spare room and no patience for complaining. She said it with the bluntness that was her signature, but she also said it while looking at Milo's hands, at the torn fingernails, at the cracked knuckles, and her bluntness was the kind that holds its tenderness inside where no one can see it. Milo moved into Martha's spare room, a real room with a real bed, with a real stove in the next room and real walls that held real heat. He slept 14 hours the first night. Martha did not wake him. She checked on him twice, the way she checked on calves, standing in the doorway, listening for breathing, counting the seconds between breaths. When he woke, she fed him potato soup and bread with butter and a cup of warm milk from the cow that had survived the cold snap, only because Martha had banked hay bales against every wall of her barn and kept a kerosene heater burning in the stall. She did not ask him about the cellar. She did not ask him about August. She fed him and told him the chore schedule and said that in her house, everyone worked, everyone ate, and no one slept in a building that was not heated. Anton came 2 days later. He came with a proposition, not charity. He told Martha that he needed a helper for the spring cellar repair season, a boy who could crawl into spaces too small for a man with bad knees and a damaged hand, a boy who could tap stone and read mortar and identify load-bearing joints. He would pay Milo 50 cents a day plus meals. The money would go to Martha for Milo's board. Martha said, "Can he handle the work?" Anton said, "He already has." Milo began working with Anton the following week when the cold eased enough to travel between farms. Their first job was not at the Bruner place. It was at the Detmer farm, where the root cellar had shifted during the freeze and 2 courses of brick had cracked along the back wall. Anton taught, and Milo learned, and the teaching was not the teaching of a master to an apprentice, but the teaching of a man to a younger version of the same kind of mind, careful, observant, patient with stone, and impatient with carelessness. They repaired the Detmer cellar in 3 days. They replaced the cracked brick with salvage from a demolished chicken coop foundation. They remortared the joints with a lime and sand mix that Anton prepared in a bucket, adjusting the ratio by feel, adding water a splash at a time until the mortar held its shape when squeezed. He showed Milo how to butter a brick, spreading mortar on the top and one end with a flat trowel, then pressing it into place with a twist that seated it and squeezed the excess out in a thin ribbon. "A wall is a conversation between bricks," Anton said. "Each brick asks the one below it to hold weight. Each brick asks the one beside it to share load. If you set one badly, every brick above it inherits the mistake." Milo remembered this. He would remember it for the rest of his life, not as a metaphor, but as a fact about masonry that was also, unavoidably, a fact about everything else. The relationship between Anton and Milo deepened through work, not through conversation. They did not discuss feelings. They did not share confidences over campfires. They worked side by side in root cellars and cool rooms and foundation pits, and the work itself was the language. Anton's backstory emerged in fragments, the way a mason's history emerges from the walls he has built, not all at once, but in details visible only to someone paying attention. He had come from Moravia in 1899, at 15, with a cousin who died of typhus in the immigrant barracks at Baltimore. He had learned bricklaying from an uncle in Cedar Rapids who beat him when the mortar was wrong and praised him when the corners were plumb. He had built creamery cellars across central Minnesota during the dairy boom. Cool rooms designed to hold milk at 38 degrees through the summer, insulated with sawdust and straw, ventilated with clay pipes not unlike the drain under the Bruner barn. During Prohibition, he had repaired and sealed the underground rooms where farmers hid their stills and their jugs, and he had never told anyone which farms he had worked on, because a mason who talks about hidden rooms does not get hired to build them. His left hand had been damaged in 1928, not in a work accident, but in a fight. A farmer whose cellar Anton had repaired accused him of stealing a jug of whiskey. The farmer swung a maul. Anton blocked it with his left hand. The last 2 fingers shattered and healed curled, and the farmer apologized a week later when the jug was found behind a hay bale. But the fingers did not unshatter, and the apology did not fix what it had broken. Milo learned these things over weeks, in sentences dropped between tasks, a line about Baltimore while mixing mortar, a line about the uncle while plumbing a corner, a line about the hand while they rested on a cellar step and ate bread and cold sausage from Martha's kitchen. He also learned gradually that Anton was not well. The old man's breathing had changed. It had a rattle in it now, a wet sound at the bottom of each inhale, as though something inside his chest was filling with fluid that did not belong there. Anton dismissed it. He said it was the damp, the cellars, the spring air that carried moisture like a sponge. He said he had been coughing since 1914 and had not died yet. Milo said, "You should see a doctor." Anton said, "Doctors are for people who can afford to hear bad news." They disagreed, and the disagreement was their first not about stone or mortar or technique, but about Anton himself. Milo pushed. Anton refused. The refusal was not stubbornness. It was the particular pride of a man who had survived by being useful, and who understood that the moment he admitted he was too sick to work, he would become the thing he feared most: a burden. The disagreement did not resolve. It sat between them like a stone neither could move, present in every shared silence, visible in every coughing fit that Anton turned away to hide. Milo watched the old man's color change, from weathered brown to gray, from gray to the color of old mortar. He watched the damaged hand shake during work that had once been steady. He watched Anton rest more often, leaning against cellar walls with his eyes closed, breathing in the cool underground air as though it were medicine. Spring came hard and fast. The snow melted in sheets, turning fields into temporary lakes, filling ditches, overwhelming the drainage patterns that the frozen ground had sealed for months. Water went everywhere, into barns, into basements, into root cellars and storage pits, and every underground space that had been dry through the winter. The Brunner cellar flooded first. August, who had sealed the foundation gap and blocked the clay drain with packed dirt after Milo's removal, sealed it out of spite, out of secrecy, out of the reflexive need to close what had been opened, discovered that a sealed underground room with no drainage becomes a cistern. Water rose behind the bricks and had nowhere to go. It seeped through the mortar joints and pooled on the barn floor. The cattle stood in an inch of brown water, and August cursed and kicked at the foundation and did not ask for help. Other farms fared worse. The Hollander root cellar, which had flooded the previous fall and been hastily repaired, collapsed entirely, the back wall giving way under hydrostatic pressure, soil pouring into the chamber, destroying 3 months of stored root vegetables and burying the shelving under a tongue of cold mud. Martha's cellar held because Martha had listened. She had cleared her own drain after seeing Milo's system, and the thaw water had a path to follow. But the secondary crisis came from the Vosen place, 2 miles east, and it came fast. Carl Vosen's youngest daughter, a girl of 9 named Elsa, went into the Vosen root cellar to retrieve jars of canned tomatoes. The cellar was old, dug in 1892, shored with timbers that had been replaced once and should have been replaced twice. The entrance was a set of wooden steps descending through a hatch in the kitchen floor. The cellar was 4 feet deep in the center, with shelves along 3 walls and a packed earth floor that had been dry since construction. It was not dry now. Thaw water had been seeping through the east wall for 3 days, rising slowly, pooling around the base of the shelves. Elsa's mother had sent her down because the jars were on the second shelf and the water was only ankle deep, and the tomatoes were needed, and 9-year-old girls are small enough to navigate a flooded cellar without getting their dresses too wet. Elsa went down. She collected 4 jars. She turned to climb back up, and the east wall moved. Not collapsed, moved. The timbers bowed inward, pushed by the weight of saturated soil behind them, and the earth shifted, and the water level rose 6 inches in 4 seconds as displaced soil entered the chamber. The hatch above was still open. Elsa was still standing, but the water was at her knees now and rising, and the east wall was still moving, groaning, the timbers bending in a way that timbers bend before they snap. She screamed. Her mother screamed. Carl Vosen came running from the barn. The natural instinct was to go down the stairs, get the girl, pull her up. But the stairs were in the path of the moving wall, and anyone descending would be between the failing timbers and the hatch, caught in the compression zone if the wall let go entirely. Milo was at the Vossen farm because Anton had been hired to inspect the creamery cool room. He heard the screaming and came around the building and saw the situation in 3 seconds. The open hatch, the rising water, the bowing wall, the girl knee-deep and frozen with fear, the parents at the top of the stairs, unable to reach her without entering the collapse zone. He did not go down the stairs. He went around the house to the east side, where the cellar's air vent, a clay pipe identical in principle to the Brunner drain, protruded from the foundation 2 feet above ground level. The pipe was 6 inches in diameter, too small for a person, but Milo was not looking for an entrance. He was looking for information. He put his ear to the pipe. He heard water. He heard the creak of timbers under load, and he heard air moving through the pipe, faster than normal, pushed by the water rising in the chamber. The vent was bubbling. Water was reaching the pipe's interior opening. When the water covered the vent, the cellar would lose its air exchange, and the pressure would change, and the wall would fail completely. He ran back to the front. He said to Carl Vossen, "Do not go down the stairs. The wall is moving because water is pushing it. If you add weight to the stairs, the floor braces will shift and the wall will come in." Carl said, "My daughter's down there." Milo said, "I know. Open the upper hatch, the delivery hatch on the north side." Every root cellar of that era had 2 hatches, the interior stairs from the kitchen and an exterior delivery hatch on one wall, used to pass down bushels and barrels without carrying them through the house. The Vossen delivery hatch was on the north side, away from the failing east wall, bolted from the inside but accessible from outside if the bolt housing could be pried loose. Carl and Milo pried the bolt with a crowbar. The hatch opened outward, revealing the north wall of the cellar, dry, stable, with the water level still 6 inches below the hatch sill. Milo leaned in and called to Elsa. The girl waded across the cellar, the water at her waist now, the jars of tomatoes still clutched against her chest because she was 9 and she had been sent to get them, and she would not come back without them. Milo pulled her through the hatch. Carl took her from his arms. The jars fell and broke on the frozen ground, and the tomatoes spread across the snow like something that should not be outside in March. 40 seconds later, the east wall failed. The timbers snapped, 2 sharp reports, like gunshots, and the soil poured in, filling the cellar to the shelf line, burying the stairs, burying the spot where Elsa had been standing. If anyone had gone down the interior stairs, they would have been under the collapse. Milo sat on the Vossen porch steps afterward, and his hands were shaking. Not from cold, from the closeness of it, from the 40 seconds between a girl standing in rising water and a wall burying the place where she had stood. Anton sat beside him. The old man's breathing was bad, worse than usual, the rattle louder, the pauses between breaths longer. He had not entered the cellar. He had not helped with the hatch. He had stood by the corner of the house and watched Milo work, and his face had carried an expression that was not pride exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a man watching someone do the thing he had taught them to do, and doing it right, and doing it without being told. Anton said, "You did not guess. You listened to the vent." Milo said, "You taught me to listen." Anton said, "I taught you to hear. You taught yourself to listen? Those are different. If this story reminds you why knowing the small things, the vent, the drain, the air that moves when everything else is still, can matter more than strength or size, share it with someone who pays attention to what others miss." The rescue at the Vossen farm changed Milo's position in the community in a way that the cellar survival alone had not. Surviving was impressive. It was also personal, a boy saving himself through luck or instinct or stubbornness in circumstances that most adults would never face. But saving Elsa Vosen was public. It was witnessed. It was a 12-year-old boy reading a collapsing cellar the way a doctor reads symptoms and prescribing the correct treatment in the seconds before the diagnosis became fatal. Farmers who had nodded politely at Milo's cellar story now came to ask questions, not about surviving the cold. They had stoves for that, but about their own cellars, their own foundations, their own underground spaces that they had built or inherited and never fully understood. Was the east wall of the Detmer root cellar sound? Was the Hollander foundation draining properly since the rebuild? Could the Vosen cool room be repaired, or did it need to be dug fresh? Milo answered what he could. He deferred to Anton on what he could not, and the two of them, the old Czech mason with the damaged hand and the German orphan with the torn fingernails, moved through the township together, tapping walls, testing mortar, reading the language of stone and earth that nobody else had bothered to learn. Anton's pneumonia declared itself in the third week of March. He had been fighting it since the night he had helped drag Nels Assen into Martha's summer kitchen. The exertion, the cold, the hours of warming stones and rubbing circulation back into a frozen man's limbs. The infection had been building behind his ribs for weeks, masked by the rattle he had always had, dismissed as damp and age and the inevitable cost of a life spent working underground. He collapsed at the Reich farm in Martha's kitchen, reaching for a cup of water. He went down sideways, catching himself on the stove handle, and the stove handle was hot, and the burn on his palm did not make him flinch, which told Martha everything she needed to know about how much pain was already present. They put him in the spare room, Milo's room. Milo slept on the kitchen floor and did not complain. Martha sent the Vosen boy for the doctor in town, 12 miles, and the boy made it in 4 hours on a horse that was not built for speed, but was built for endurance, which was the more important quality. The doctor came the next day. He listened to Anton's chest with a stethoscope and said the word pneumonia, the way doctors in 1936 said it, not as a diagnosis, but as a forecast, because the antibiotics that would later make it survivable did not yet exist in rural Minnesota, and the treatment was rest, warmth, fluids, and the patient's own constitution. Anton's constitution was 63 years old, underfed, overworked, and housed in a body that had been sleeping in barns and sheds and unheated summer kitchens for 3 years. Milo sat with him. He sat in the chair beside the bed and watched the old man breathe, each breath a negotiation, each exhale a concession, the rattle deepening from a sound in the chest to a sound in the throat, to a sound that seemed to come from somewhere behind the throat, from the place where air meets the decision to continue. On the second day, Anton opened his eyes and looked at Milo and said, "The mason's line is in my coat. Left pocket." Milo found it, a coil of heavy twine, chalked white with lime, used to mark straight lines on brick and stone. It was wound tight around a wooden spool that had been carved by hand, and the spool was smooth from years of handling, and the chalk was so deeply embedded in the fiber that the twine would never be any color other than white. Anton said, "Do not trust stone because it is old. Trust it after you test it." He closed his eyes. He died the following morning before the light came through the window. Martha found him when she brought the breakfast tray. His damaged hand was resting on his chest, the curled fingers relaxed for the first time Milo had seen, as though the muscles that had held them shut for 8 years had finally released their argument. Milo did not cry. He stood in the doorway and looked at the still form under the quilt, and the mason's line pressed against his palm through his pocket, and the room smelled of the camphor Martha had rubbed on Anton's chest, and the lime dust that was always in the old man's clothes, and the particular stillness that a room acquires when the person who animated it has left. The line, dusted with lime, became Milo's inheritance. Not property, not money, not land. A tool, and the knowledge of how to use it, and the trust of a man who had recognized in a 12-year-old boy the same careful eye that had guided his own hands for 48 years. Martha buried Anton in the Lutheran cemetery, though he was Catholic and Czech and had attended no church in Stearns County. She paid for the burial herself. She said it was the cost of decency, and decency was a bill she had never failed to pay. Milo went back to work 3 days after the burial, not because the grief had passed. It had not, and would not for a long time, but because the cellars did not wait for grief. The thaw was advancing, water was moving. Foundations that had held through the freeze were now being tested by the opposite force. Not cold contracting the earth, but water expanding it, seeping through mortar joints, undermining footings, pushing against walls that had been designed to hold soil, not rivers. He went alone. He carried Anton's tools, the files, the trowels, the plumb line, the mason's line in his pocket. He went to the farms that had asked for help, and he tapped walls and checked mortar and cleared drains. And when he found something he did not know, he stopped and thought about what Anton would have done. And the answer usually came, not as memory but as logic, the logic of stone, the logic of water, the logic of pressure and load, and the patient physics of underground spaces. He did not claim to know everything. He told the Hollander woman that her foundation needed a professional rebuild, not a patch. He told Carl Vosen that the failed root cellar should be filled in and a new one dug 10 feet north, away from the water table. He told Detmer that his cellar walls were sound, but his ventilation was insufficient and would breed mold by June. He was 12 years old. He spoke with the authority of someone who had slept in the knowledge he was sharing, who had tested it with his own body, who had staked his life on the physics and found the physics reliable. The hostile skeptic had not finished. August Brunner, facing the county investigation that Klinkner had initiated, tried 2 more moves during the spring. He told the feed store owner that Milo had stolen hidden liquor from the cellar. Old bottles, he claimed, worth money, taken by the boy during his time underground. The accusation was specific enough to sound plausible. Prohibition cellars did sometimes contain forgotten inventory, and a boy desperate enough to sleep underground was desperate enough to steal. But Milo had taken nothing except dried apples from a sealed jar. And Anton had been in the cellar and could testify. Except Anton was dead, which meant the accusation was August's word against a dead man's silence and a 12-year-old boy's denial. Martha countered. She went to the feed store and said in front of 4 witnesses that she had personally inspected Milo's belongings when he arrived at her house, and the boy owned 1 flour sack of clothes, 1 folding rule, 1 harness buckle, 1 pair of borrowed mittens, and not a single bottle, jug, or vessel of any kind. She said if August Brunner could produce a single witness who saw the boy carry anything from that cellar other than a gray cat, she would eat her own fence posts. No witness appeared. August's accusation dissolved the way accusations dissolve in small communities, not through formal retraction, but through the slow withdrawal of people willing to repeat it. The investigation continued. Klinkner's notes combined with Martha's testimony, Anton's observations recorded before his death, and the physical evidence of the barn loft, the single blanket, the frost feathers, the broken ladder rung, the gaps in the north wall, created a record that the county could not ignore. August was not charged with a crime. Child neglect in 1936 Rural Minnesota was not prosecuted the way it would be later, but the placement was terminated, the monthly payment stopped, and the county added a note to its foster records recommending that all future placements include inspection of sleeping quarters. It was not justice, it was paperwork, but paperwork in a system built on paperwork was the beginning of change. The summer of 1936 was the summer Milo Eater became visible. Not famous. Fame was a thing that belonged to cities and radio shows and people whose names appeared in newspapers, but visible in the way that mattered in northern Stearns County, as a person whose knowledge had practical value and whose presence at a task meant the task would be done correctly. He was still 12. He turned 13 in August, and Martha Reich marked the day with a cake made from a recipe she had brought from her mother's kitchen in Freeport. A yellow cake with boiled sugar frosting, dense enough to anchor a fence post. She did not sing. She did not make a speech. She set the cake on the table and said, "You have earned a year. Eat." Milo ate. Needles sat under the table and received crumbs with the quiet dignity of a cat who had saved a boy's life and expected no less than cake for it. The work continued through the summer and into the fall. Without Anton, Milo was the only person in the township who could read a cellar the way a doctor reads a body, by touch, by sound, by the subtle signs of stress and failure that announce themselves long before the collapse. He did not advertise. He did not need to. The Vosen rescue had been witnessed by enough people that the story carried itself, and the story carried Milo's name with it, and his name carried the implicit promise that a boy who could save a girl from a flooding cellar could probably tell you whether your own cellar was safe. He worked for 50 cents a day when people could pay, and for meals when they could not. Martha kept his accounts in a ledger book, the same ledger she used for her own farm expenses. And the entries told a story of their own. Repair mortar for Detmer 3 days. Drain clearing for Hollander 1 day. Foundation inspection for Vosen Creamery 2 days. Vent installation for the Assen place, where Nels had recovered from his frostbite but walked with a limp and could not do cellar work himself. Each job taught Milo something Anton had not had time to teach him. He learned that sandy soil drains fast but shifts under load, and that clay soil holds water but provides a stable footing. He learned that a cellar dug into a hillside can use the slope for drainage, but a cellar dug into flat ground needs a sump, a low point where water collects and can be baled or pumped. He learned that whitewash on interior walls is not decoration, but a diagnostic tool. Mold grows dark on white surfaces, and a cellar keeper who whitewashes every spring can see the first signs of ventilation failure before the air goes bad. He learned these things by doing them wrong and then doing them right, and the interval between wrong and right shortened with every job, because he was paying attention. And paying attention was the thing Anton had recognized in him, and the thing that no amount of teaching can create in someone who does not already possess it. August Bruner's farm continued to deteriorate through the spring and summer. The county investigation had not resulted in charges, but it had resulted in something worse for August: visibility. The community now knew what had happened in that barn. They knew about the loft, the single blanket, the locked tool shed, the kicked snow against the foundation. They knew because Martha had told them, and because Klinkner's visits had been noticed, and because in a community of 40 families spread across 6 square miles, a secret stays secret only as long as no one has a reason to tell it. August's attempted sale of the farm failed in May. A buyer from Sauk Center had expressed interest, but the buyer's lawyer discovered the county investigation in the placement records, and the lawyer discovered the unreported underground structure, and the buyer withdrew. August blamed Milo. He blamed the county. He blamed Anton, who was dead and could not defend himself. He did not blame his own decision to put a child in an unheated loft while a habitable space sat beneath his barn floor. The irony arrived in June, and it arrived through water. August had sealed the cellar entrance after Milo's removal. He had packed the foundation gap with mortar and rubble. He had filled the clay drain with dirt and tamped it flat. He had done this not because sealing a cellar is good practice. It is not, but because the cellar's existence had brought the county to his door, and in August's logic, closing the cellar was the same as closing the investigation. But a sealed cellar with no drainage becomes a reservoir. The spring thaw water that had been draining through the clay pipe for years now had nowhere to go. It seeped through the mortar joints and pooled in the brick chamber. It rose slowly, steadily, the way water rises in any enclosed space, without urgency, without sound, with the patience of a force that has no schedule and no opposition. By June, the water had reached the barn floor. It seeped through the fieldstone foundation and spread across the packed earth, turning the stalls to mud, rotting the base of the stall posts, creating a smell of wet earth and mold that the cattle objected to by refusing to stand in their usual places. August stored potatoes, which we had moved to the barn after the house cellar proved too warm in summer, sat in burlap sacks on the barn floor. The sacks wicked up the water. The potatoes softened, then blackened, then began to smell like something that had once been food and had made other plans. His seed sacks for the fall planting, rye and oats, purchased on credit from the elevator in town, sat on the same floor. When August discovered the water, the bottom inch of each sack was wet. Wet seed rots. Rotted seed does not germinate. Seed purchased on credit and then destroyed must still be paid for. August stood in his barn and looked at the water and the ruined potatoes and the darkening seed sacks and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the cellar he had sealed was not an enemy that could be walled off, but a system that required management, and he had managed it the way he managed everything, with force, secrecy, and the assumption that ignoring a problem long enough would make it someone else's. He sent Lenora to Martha's farm. Lenora, who had taken the quilt from Milo's loft. Lenora, who had fed the boy on the porch step. Lenora came to Martha's kitchen and sat at the table and said that August needed help with the barn drainage, and could the boy come? Martha said, "The boy has a name." Lenora said, "Can Milo come?" Martha looked at Milo, who was sitting at the far end of the table cleaning mortar from a set of Anton's trowels. She did not answer for him. She waited. Milo said, "I will go." He went, not out of forgiveness, not out of charity. He went because the cellar was a system he understood, and a system that fails hurts more than the person who broke it. It hurts the animals standing in the water, the soil absorbing the rot, the foundation stones being pushed by pressure they were not designed to hold. He arrived at the Bruner barn and found August standing in the doorway. August did not greet him. He did not apologize. He did not reference the loft, the blanket, the kicked snow, the county investigation. He stood aside and let Milo enter and said 5 words. "You know the underpart of this place better than I do." Milo looked at him. He looked at the water on the barn floor, the ruined potatoes, the darkened seed sacks. He looked at the south foundation where the entrance stones had been mortared shut. He said, "I listened when it was trying to tell you." He spent 2 days reopening the cellar. He chipped out August's mortar, removed the rubble, cleared the clay drain, and let the water find its path. The cellar drained in 18 hours. The barn floor dried in 3 days. The seed sacks were a loss. The bottom inch of rye was blackened, and the oats had begun to sprout in the sack. But the potatoes could be sorted, the worst discarded, the rest salvaged. Milo did not charge August. He told Martha he did not want August's money. Martha said that was his choice, and she respected it, but she wanted him to know that not charging was not the same as forgiving. Milo said he knew. August did not thank him. But August did not seal the cellar again. And when the county investigator came for the final visit in September, August did not object when the man walked the property and inspected the barn, and noted that the underground structure was open, ventilated, and in usable condition. The investigation closed with a finding of inadequate care and a recommendation against future placements with the Bruner family. August signed the finding without reading it. He signed it the way a man signs something he does not want to fight anymore, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has run out of the energy required for denial. It was not a warm scene. It was not reconciliation. It was the grudging, graceless acknowledgement of a man who had been wrong in a way that almost killed a child, confronted by the child who had survived not because of him, but despite him. The satisfaction was not emotional. It was structural. The power had reversed, not through anger or vengeance, but through competence. And competence is the quietest and most durable form of authority. Clara Vosen entered the story the way most important people enter stories, without announcement through a side door carrying something practical. She was Carl Vosen's oldest daughter, 15, tall, with her father's square jaw and her mother's patience. She had been present at Elsa's rescue, but had not spoken to Milo during it. She had watched from the porch, holding her younger sister's coat while the adult shouted and Milo worked, and she had noticed something that no one else had mentioned afterward. Milo had not panicked. He had not shouted. He had walked around the house, put his ear to the vent, listened for 4 seconds, and then told a grown man exactly what to do. She had seen adults panic. She had never seen a boy her age not panic, and the absence of panic interested her more than its presence ever could. She came to Martha's farm in October, carrying a broken thermometer from the Vosen creamery. The mercury tube had cracked, and her father needed it repaired or replaced. Martha told her Milo might know where Anton had sourced dairy thermometers. Clara found Milo at the workbench in Martha's shed, sharpening a cold chisel. She said, "The creamery thermometer is broken. Can you fix it?" Milo looked at the thermometer. The tube was cracked at the base. The mercury pooled in the bulb. He said, "I cannot fix glass, but I can show you how to mount a new tube in the old housing." She said, "Show me." He showed her. She watched with the same quality of attention that Milo gave to stonework, complete, unhurried, retaining what she saw. She asked questions that were not questions of curiosity, but questions of application. What temperature should the creamery cool room hold? How do you know if the thermometer is reading true? What happens to milk stored at 42 degrees versus 38? Milo answered what he could. He said he did not know milk temperatures because he was not a dairyman, but he knew that Anton had built cool rooms designed for 38 degrees, and the design depended on wall thickness, soil contact, ventilation rate, and the volume of the space. Clara said, "My father's cool room is too warm in July." Milo said, "Then the ventilation is wrong, or the walls are too thin, or both." Clara said, "Can you come look at it?" He went. He looked. The walls were too thin. Single-course brick instead of the double course that Anton had specified for all his creamery work. The ventilation was adequate, but poorly placed, drawing warm air from the south instead of cool air from the north. Milo recommended a second course of brick on the interior, insulated with sawdust between the courses and a redirected vent intake. Clara helped. She mixed mortar. She carried brick. She held the plumb line while Milo laid courses, and she learned to read the line the way Milo had learned by watching the weight at the bottom and trusting the string to tell the truth that the eye might miss. Their partnership formed through work the way Milo's partnership with Anton had formed through work, not through conversation about feelings, but through the shared language of tasks done together, problems solved together, mistakes made and corrected together. Clara was not a replacement for Anton. She was something different, a peer, someone who learned at the same speed Milo taught, someone who asked the questions that pushed him past what he already knew into what he had not yet figured out. Their courtship, in later years, grew from the same root. Milo was 16 when he first understood that the feeling he had when Clara arrived at a job site was not professional appreciation, but something older and less rational. Clara was 18 when she told Martha Reich that the Eder boy had good hands and a good eye, and would probably make a decent husband if someone told him to ask. Martha told Milo. Milo asked. Clara said yes with the same directness she brought to mortar mixing. No hesitation, no qualification, no pretense that the question required deliberation. They married when Milo was 20. The ceremony was at the Lutheran church in the township, and Martha Reich stood as witness, and Needle, old now, gray going to white, the split ear drooping with age, sat on the church steps and accepted scraps from the wedding dinner with the serene entitlement of a cat who had, in a meaningful sense, made the whole thing possible. By the early 1940s, Milo and Clara Eder had built a business that was not a business in any formal sense. No sign, no office, no advertisements in the county paper. But that functioned as one. They retrofitted farm cellars across 3 townships. They measured frost depth, drainage grade, vent height, soil type, and safe entrance width. They installed proper hatches with hinged frames, screened vents that kept animals out while preserving airflow, gravel drainage beds, brick splash channels for thaw water, and whitewashed interior walls. They did not sell a miracle. They did not promise that a cellar would survive every storm or hold every temperature. They measured, assessed, recommended, and sometimes refused. Milo turned down 2 jobs in a single month, a farmer who wanted a cellar dug in a floodplain, and another who wanted to convert a well pit into a storage room without proper ventilation. He said no the way Anton would have said no, quietly, with specific reasons, without apology. No stored cabbage is worth a dead child, he told the well pit farmer. If the air cannot move, the room cannot breathe, and a room that cannot breathe will kill whoever is inside it when the weather changes. The farmer argued. Milo did not. He packed his tools and left. The farmer hired someone else, a man from Melrose who dug basements for a living, and the converted well pit flooded the following spring and had to be filled in with gravel and abandoned. Clara handled the measurements that Milo found tedious, the bookkeeping, the material orders, the scheduling. She also handled the clients who found Milo too quiet, too young, too unwilling to explain his reasoning in terms they found comfortable. Clara could translate Milo's terse assessments into language that farmers understood and accepted, and she could do it without softening the assessment or compromising the recommendation. She was the voice where Milo was the hands, and together they covered the distance that neither could have covered alone. They raised 2 children, a boy and a girl, in a farmhouse that Martha Reich left them when she died in 1948. The house had a cellar that Milo had inspected, repaired, and improved every year since he was 13. It was the best cellar in the township. It held 34 degrees in the coldest winter and 42 in the warmest summer, and breathed through a ventilation system that Milo had designed based on Anton's creamery principles, scaled to a residential space. Needle's descendants lived in the yard. Gray cats, some with split ears, some without, all with the same fluid movement and the same instinct for underground warmth. Milo never turned a cat away from the property. Clara said it was sentiment. Milo said it was insurance. Both were right. Anton's mason's line stayed in a tin box on the bedroom shelf. The chalk had faded from white to cream, and the twine had softened with age, but the spool was still smooth and the line still ran true. Milo took it to every job. He never used another line. When his son asked why, Milo said, "Because this one was given by a man who trusted me to use it correctly, and using it correctly is how I keep the trust." The community transformation was visible in details that only someone who had known the township before would notice. Barns that had been treated as mere animal shelters were inspected for drafts, foundation integrity, and hidden cavities. Root cellars that had been dug by grandparents and never reevaluated were tested, mortar tapped, vents cleared, drainage checked, air quality assessed with candle flame and straw stem. Children who had been placed casually in outbuildings during hard weather were given heated sleeping spaces because the county records now included a box for sleeping quarter inspection, added by Jonas Klinkner in 1937, referencing case number 417 Chow's The Brunner placement. The box was small. The change was small. But smallness is not the same as insignificance, and a box on a county form that forces an inspector to look at where a child sleeps before signing the placement is a wall between a child and the cold, as real as brick, as functional as a vent. Milo Eder did not describe the hidden chamber as luck. When people asked him how he had survived, he said the same thing every time, the same words in the same order, as though the sentence had been built from the same careful masonry that he applied to everything else. He said, "Luck was the cat. Survival was listening." There is a February night in northern Stearns County when the air turns blue-black and the cold presses against every surface like a hand testing a wall for weakness. The snow does not fall on nights like this. It is too cold for snow. The sky is clear, and the stars are hard, and the silence is so complete that a nail popping in a barn board can be heard from the house. On a night like that, in a winter decades after the one that nearly killed him, Milo Eder sits in a cellar he built with his own hands. The walls are double-course brick, laid on a gravel bed, mortared with the lime and sand mix that Anton Pexa taught him to prepare by feel. The ventilation draws through a screen north intake and exhausts through a south clay pipe, and the air moves slowly, steadily, the way underground air moves when the system is correct. August Brunner once stood over a 12-year-old boy in a frozen barn and said, "Taking lessons from a mouser now." The mouser is long dead. August is long dead. The barn leans further south than it did in 36, and the loft ladder has lost another rung, and the north wall gaps have widened to the point where wind passes through without resistance. But the cellar beneath it, the bricked room built by bootleggers and discovered by a cat and claimed by a boy who had nothing else, still holds its temperature, still breathes, still keeps its own weather in the dark. Milo's hand rests on a brick wall. A gray barn cat, one of Needle's many descendants, slips through a square of winter light above him and drops to the ledge and begins to wash its paws. The wall holds steady. The air smells of earth. Outside, the wind spends itself against the snow, and the snow gives nothing back, and the earth beneath the frost line keeps what it has always kept, a warmth that is not made but found, not burned but held, patient and deep and older than any winter that has tried to take it.